Okay, so good evening. Welcome everybody to tonight's event. I think it's the last one this year in the IWM. Nice you made it. So we are the editors of the book, this one. We are presenting it to you and we are having some discussions, and I usually judge a book by its cover. That's why I printed this version of the cover, and my book presentation starts with the critique of the cover. So as you, it was my choice, but you agreed. So we took this very famous. It was not made for us, as you can guess. So this is El Lissitzky, and the name is Braun. I don't know how you pronounce it. From 1923. In the Sprengel Museum in Hanover. So we took this, but I think the publisher did not a very good job with the colors. So the colors are in original with better contrast, and I think so. As you might see already with this one, it's a bit too brownish to my taste. So, but this is the only critique you will hear from me in the next minute. More to come. First, I would like to introduce to you the editors of the book, which are Andreas Fahrmeir and Gunther Hellmann. They both came from Frankfurt to Vienna to discuss the book with you. Andreas Fahrmeir holds a chair for history, and particularly history of the 19th century at Goethe University in Frankfurt. He is a successor, if I may say so, of Lothar Gall. And before that, he studied, I think also with Lothar Gall, from 1989 to 1994, history at Frankfurt University, but also, and in particular, history of natural sciences and English philology. He has written his PhD in Cambridge and worked after that at the Deutsches Historisches Institut in London. In 2002, he did his habilitation at Frankfurt University, and then, before anybody of us knew Breaking Bad, he was Heisenberg Fellow from the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. Then, from 2004 to 2006, he had a chair at Cologne University. His main interests in teaching and research are civil society, so to say, of the 19th century, the metropoles, German-British history, history of migration, political history of the 19th century, and I would like to name his monographs, which is Revolution and Reforms Europe from 1789 to 1850, Munich 2010, Citizenship, The Rise and Fall of a Modern Concept, 2007. And now comes a tricky and very ambitious title. It's in German, Ehrbare Spekulanten. And I would like to ask you about the translation of Ehrbare Spekulanten, which is a very fascinating combination. How you would do?
Probably honorable speculators.
Okay, honorable speculators, Stadtverfassung, Wirtschaft and Politik in der City of London. Then Citizens and Aliens, Foreigners and the Law in Britain and the German State, 1789 to 1870, published with Birken Books in 2000. And Gunther Hellmann is professor of political science at Goethe University. He specializes in international relations. His research interests and teaching are in the fields of German foreign policy, European and transatlantic security, and the theory of international relations. Before assuming his position in Frankfurt, he taught at Free University in Berlin, Darmstadt University of Technology. He directed a research group, International Organizations, at the Frankfurt Peace Research Institute. And he is one of the publishers of the Zeitschrift für internationale Beziehungen, ZIB, the premier German IR journal. Currently, he is a PI, a principal investigator, which is really something in the German academic world, in the Frankfurt cluster formation of normative orders. He held the Stephen Miller Chair in German Studies in the Bologna Center of Johns Hopkins University, and in 2012 he was Harris Distinguished Visiting Professor at Dartmouth College, Hanover, New Hampshire. Last year and before that volume, he edited Theorizing Foreign Policy in a Globalized World with Knut Erik Jørgensen and Werner Link, with a very fascinating cover too. And finally, I am Miloš Vec, and the third editor of this volume. I have a chair for European Legal and Constitutional History at the University of Vienna. And since January 1st, 2016, I'm permanent fellow here at the IWM. My research interests are the history of international relations, of international law in particular, and what I call multi-normativity, which are the entanglements between legal and non-legal normative orders like morals, social custom, technical norms. And I have still an affiliation with the Frankfurt Cluster of Excellence, being an associate member since, I think, autumn 2013. So our plan for the next 70 minutes is as follows. First, Gunther will give you an idea about the context of the whole volume, and I'm really curious how he will do that in very few minutes. Then Andreas, as a historian in the tricky position working on himself, will elaborate on the genesis of the whole project that led to that volume. I'm even more curious what he will tell about us. Then we will enter into a discussion among the three editors, trying to reassure each other that we have understood what we have written and edited. And then, after all, you, the audience, is invited to ask questions and make comments. This is where the rubber hits the road, so to say. And as usual, we will end at 7:30 p.m. Okay, so I would like now to ask Gunther content of the whole volume in the next. I have given you 5 to 9 minutes for 304 pages. Gunther, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks, Miloš, and thanks also for coming tonight, because this is a very special visit. All of us have been looking forward to it, and given Miloš's intellectual skills, he had schemed this smart division of labor. Let's see what I come up with. Given my background in international relations, of course, my perspective on the project is a different one, as you will see later on when we exchange different views. But I think, and Andreas is going to talk a little bit more about the genesis of the project itself. The way that I look at the project in drawing up a few notes for this brief introduction is, and I've been rereading sections of it, that it is really special, I believe, in the sense of trying to do something that, at least against the background of my own discipline, there's fairly little literature out there. It tries to theorize and historicize foreign policy as a unique political practice from different disciplinary angles. And this I think is important in many ways. 3 different disciplines means there are international relations scholars involved as myself. That's a discipline that is, in its mainstream, fairly positivistic. We have historians, which of course have, in contrast to my own discipline, where theory of a positivist sort, most importantly, plays a very distinct role in shaping disciplinary cultures, where historians in general tend to be rather critical as far as theory of the large capital letters is concerned. And we have legal historians where the discipline of international law in itself has its own distinctive ways of looking and conceptualizing things. We thought that it might be really worth looking at foreign policy as a historical practice that goes well beyond what we normally conceptualize as the Westphalian state system. We, now meaning of course, mainly international relations scholars who tend to, not all of them, not all my colleagues, but a strong part of it, especially those who are assembled under the rubric of foreign policy analysis. That's a particular subfield in international relations, where the Westphalian system in itself is a fairly steady period where foreign policy is a practice without much of a history in itself. It's a practice that has to be theorized, but need not be historicized. And I believe that what you're doing in the project is really coming from these different disciplinary angles and shedding light on the practice of foreign policy way beyond the normal fixation, at least in my own discipline, on the Westphalian period. The common point of departure that we have been working on over a series of workshops has been that it would be meaningful, in contrast to quite a few ways of conceptualizing foreign policy, to look at it as a unique political practice of boundary drawing. So it's not interstate, intergovernmental relations, but it's a particular political practice of boundary drawing that is, as I said, not limited to the Westphalian period, and that is, in contrast to some of my own discipline, that is patterned. That is, you have a notion of repeated types of activities, but it is also important, we argue in the book, to historicize these kinds of patterned practices. To say that foreign policy is not limited to the Westphalian period means that in order to analyze it as a particular political practice, contrasted, for instance, with domestic politics, one would look at certain institutionalized ways of conducting foreign policy. And you immediately, in terms of a distinction between the domestic and the foreign, come across institutions that, in conceptual terms, have a much longer history than what we normally call foreign policy. The word itself and the practice it relates to has been invented in the 17th century, essentially. So there was no foreign policy before that. So there is a link, of course, to the Westphalian system. But we argue in the book that since institutions and practices that are normally related with political communities of a particular sort, such as war making, diplomacy, espionage, have a history that dates way beyond that particular period, it does make sense to look at foreign policy as a distinct form of boundary drawing that includes these kinds of practices as typical and distinguishing the foreign from the domestic. The book argues, and that is spelled out in a series of very different kinds of chapters, that it makes sense to reconceptualize foreign policy along these lines, that is, as a distinct practice of the political in terms of boundary drawing, because we will also gain theoretical leverage, so to say, in examining the interplay of the formation of international orders, political orders of the international, and the changing practices of foreign policy that have constituted and brought about these international orders. And as soon as you think about it in these terms, it's clear that the Westphalian period is just one period where the international practices of war-making, diplomacy, and espionage have been critical in shaping the formation of international systems. Historical moments of transformation are key points where we think it might be useful to examine how foreign policy so to say, leads to new forms of institutional solutions to the domestic in order to distinguish the domestic from the foreign, and thereby practice certain forms of inclusion and exclusion that help to understand both new ways of forming international orders and how ways of practicing foreign policy, even though they are patterned, might be changing over time. How am I doing in terms of time?
Okay.
just a brief, just a brief, since Miloš said I should give you an idea what the book is about in terms also of its structure. Now, this is, of course, a political science / international relations way of looking at the project. If you look at the different chapters, you will see immediately that the colleagues from history, from international law, approach the subject matter, of course, within certain disciplinary traditions. And the way that we have been setting up the whole project, at least as the volume that you have here is concerned, is that we're not claiming, so to say, to cover in some systematic fashion the globe or the entire history of what we would say is a history where foreign policy has been practiced, but we are obviously picking certain distinct phases, certain distinct areas in order to illustrate, so to say, in different kinds of cases, how these historical moments of transformation of foreign policy might be illustrated. So we have chapters on ancient Greece, a field where my colleagues, at least in international relations, would say it doesn't make much sense to speak about foreign policy in that particular period, but in terms of a conception of inclusive and exclusive practices, our colleagues here, in particular Hans Beck and Hartmut Lepin, show how it might be indeed useful to look at ancient Greece and the Roman Empire in terms of a conceptual vocabulary that focuses on foreign policy as practices. We then have chapters besides Miloš's and mine that are more conceptual in the sense of looking at the concept of foreign policy and the international and the domestic. International law in the 19th century. We have chapters that focus more on the 19th century by Andreas Fahrmeir. You can say more about that yourself, I guess. Then international law by Luigi Nuzzo, especially on how different practices in the colonial period have been shaping international law in that particular field. Verena Steller on foreign policy transformation in the context of the Versailles Treaty, and three colleagues who've been looking more in terms of an international relations perspective, international law perspective on modern practices, global cities as foreign policy actors, and colleagues Christa Jöns and Paul Sharp on diplomatic practices in the contemporary period. Again, this is a far-reaching and I believe quite unique effort to bring together different disciplines in order to broaden our ways of looking at foreign policy. In particular, at least that was one of my initial motivations to join the project, in particular to examine to what extent foreign policy is a practice that is here to stay, so to say. If you're familiar with some of Jürgen Habermas's work, and of course others, the term Weltinnenpolitik, world domestic politics, comes up in different contexts. And although this is not a central element of the book, obviously the idea of transforming and also in some sense also perhaps overcoming foreign policy as a political practice in the context of world domestic politics is an appealing idea. In essence, we come to the conclusion in the book that it is too ambitious and perhaps also too idealistic conception, because many of those instances of political practices, exclusionary and inclusionary, that we are examining, reinforce the message that over time and in different historical periods, those excluding and including practices of the domestic and the foreign have been repeating themselves, have been transforming the international system, but the foreign, at least I would say as a result of my participation here, is here to stay for some time.
Many thanks. We will come back to that later on, and I think we would have many comments and observations on that. But first I would like to ask Andreas to give a short sketch about the history of the project itself, so you can have some kind of imagination, maybe why we're doing that, or at least how we did that, and how we ended up here in Vienna with that book.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for me also for coming. There's obviously a temptation to tell a systematic and kind of logical and plausible history as to how this volume emerged. But I think, or at least in my recollection, it's also a history of contingencies. One contingency being the existence of this so-called cluster of excellence as a format that encouraged interdisciplinary collaboration, made it or lubricated it, shall we say, with financial means, but also encouraged a kind of a group formation based on geographical accident, namely on who happened to be in Frankfurt at the time, which applies in a sense particularly to me because I'm not really a historian of foreign policy, or at least very few foreign fellow historians would see it that way, but have an interest in boundary drawing and a sort of affinity to legal history from other pursuits, particularly the citizenship interest. And in my recollection, it was sort of Gunther who suggested that thinking about the question of how you conceptualize foreign policy in a very long-term approach might be an interesting use of the freedom of action, but also the sort of initiatives that the cluster produced, which is how we came to put together, I think around 2010, a project on the formation of foreign policy that had sort of two branches. One branch was that there were 3 PhD theses by Friederike Grunz, Ursula Stark, and Johannes Weber, who did case studies on sort of 18th century boundary drawing, on the practices of the creation of the foreign and the domestic in 19th century conferences, and on sort of differentiated boundaries in the mandate structure that emerged after the First World War. And accompanying these more individual research projects, we also decided to hold 2 conferences, one in Bologna and one in Frankfurt, inviting sort of specialists in the field from the 3 disciplines involved to debate simply the question of if one wanted to develop a language for the conceptualization of foreign policy that extends this or that bridges this caesura of the Westphalian system, how would one actually go about doing it? Originally, the empirical topics ranged much more widely than ultimately entered the book, beginning in ancient Mesopotamia and containing papers on the Middle Ages and early modern topics as well. And ultimately, during these conferences, the impression grew on us that turning this into a book would be interesting, but also challenging, and that would like to try to meet this challenge with a number of people that were at this conference, and I think we have to say we're very grateful to many that they stuck it out with us over what then turned out to be a first submission of the manuscript, a series of revisions for the 3 of us, numerous meetings at Frankfurt Airport, which is where we met mornings before Miloš would take the flight to Vienna, and we would move on to our respective offices on campus, ultimately producing what ended up as a mixture between a collective monograph and a collection of essays, in that I think for a piece of work that has its origins in a sense as the conference volume, when one looks at it in retrospect, a relatively large proportion ended up being written either individually or collectively by the editors. But I think also integrated well specialists from outside our field for other historical periods or for other theoretical or empirical approaches. So that, in a sense, partly to our surprise and very much to our pleasant surprise, the book was then published around 6 years after I think the project started.
Many thanks, Andreas. In the next 25 to 30 minutes, I would like to recollect and debate some of the basic assumptions, observations of the volume with my co-editors. As you have heard, we are departing from the observation that there is a binary code. There is the domestic and the foreign. Maybe one could say there is the national and there is the international. So there is some kind of dichotomy, and this dichotomy is reproduced through many instances, through, I don't know, academic perspectives, and so the claim that foreign policy is about drawing and managing boundaries is our starting point. And I would like to ask my two co-editors about these boundaries. I mean, are there real boundaries, or is that also some kind of metaphor in that sense?
Well, as I take it from just rereading some of the chapters in preparation for tonight, we have come out, I mean, over time and in comparing the different angles, or looking at boundary drawing practices, in saying that there's always multiple ways of looking at boundary drawing, that the way that the foreign and the domestic are distinguished over time changes, that it does change also, that how harsh the boundaries in terms of foreign policy practices are drawn. And of course, if you look at least from an IR type of perspective, at some of the key tools of foreign policy, war making, diplomacy, and espionage, has become much more interesting since the time that we have ended the book. I mean, Snowden and the revelations over, spying out Chancellor Merkel and the Germans spying out the French. That is a boundary within the European Union that has come to be redrawn in a fundamental way as far as the foreign and the domestic is concerned. There is, I mean, even institutionally, a European foreign policy these days. You might say, well, there's not much in terms of substance. There's no army. There's a limited diplomatic corps. But still, the European Union has formally decided and institutionalized a practice of foreign policy, which has been exclusively reserved in the past to states. So we do see a different type of boundary drawing when it comes to distinguishing between the foreign and the domestic within the European Union, which I think is a historically quite unique instance, how the shifting way of thinking about the domestic and the foreign has materialized institutionally. And in the book, I mean, in the concluding chapter, we refer to the refugee crisis as an interesting contemporary phenomenon of observing how ways of including and excluding within a European context, joint European context on the one hand, and domestic contexts on the other. I mean, here in Austria, I mean, you had your own experience with refugees in a certain way, and how domestic national boundaries have become newly important against the background of the Schengen agreement. So over time, and this is, so to say, the IR perspective on contemporary European foreign policy practices, over time, what I take away from the project is that the way that boundary drawing has been shifting in terms of political community formation is an interesting, a fascinating, a patterned way of development over time in terms of transformations of international orders, but it's also always linked, at least that would be an IR, international relations scholar perspective, to those critical elements that are tools of foreign policy, that is war making, diplomacy, and espionage.
I would like to take up that point. You were labeling this as materializations of foreign policy. Just for curiosity, I mean, is your academic discipline, IR, doing empirical research on espionage, and are they into that? I mean, that sounds very promising, and I'm asking that because we did not include that into your volume, but this is just among us. So,
well, as a matter of fact, I mean, I'm one of my new projects is in that field. It's called security communication among democracies, and it focuses on different ways of deliberating within democracies and among democracies what threatens us. And I will probably do a small case study on espionage practices among close allies, which of course the Snowden material reveals as an interesting and fascinating, and in many ways also for a long time neglected dimension. My discipline is not well set up in terms of actually both studying it empirically, which is difficult, as you know, and theorizing it also at the same time.
That was my suspicion, and that's why I'm asking. I had the same impression that these are, so to say, that this is the dark side of the very strong ambition of theorizing foreign policy, that there is an empirical deficit, and particularly in such fields. Okay, Andreas, would you like to add something on the boundary conceptualizations?
I think this question about, are we talking about a metaphorical boundary, or are we talking about a real boundary? I think part of the argument we're making is that in terms of boundaries that map easily onto geography and that are easily recognizable, that's something that changes over time. And there's a tendency in certain periods for a preference to marking the boundary between the domestic and the foreign with a virtual or real line that may or may not be equipped with a fence or a wall, or to sort of leave boundaries as relatively fuzzy zones that may be defined by geography, but also by social standing networks and other means. What a contention is, though, I would think, or that's the way I would read it, is that the distinction between practices that mark the domestic and the non-domestic, and I think that's where our argument is that there are often different variants of non-domestic. For instance, in the 19th century, there's the domestic space of the state, but there's also and there's the distinctly non-domestic space of other states, but there's this sort of semi-domestic space of colonies that are attached to states but are not really part of them. But that the practices of engaging with something that is not domestic are clearly distinguished from practices which are. That there's a recognizable demarcation between conducting a war or using violence to bring about political change in a domestic setting, regardless of whether that would then be labeled as a revolution, a rebellion, or a riot. And I think in that sense, the argument is that if there is this recognizable distinction, then we have something that we can describe as foreign policy, and the intuition is that such recognizable distinctions exist in ancient Greece as they do today and as they probably will in the future.
But if I think about one very tricky example, like the Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, I mean, that is really a challenge to conceptualize. The Americans have chosen this bay because they say it's not domestic in terms of law, and at the same time it's not as foreign. So can you really uphold this domestic and foreign dichotomy if you look at these 21st century challenges, or is this just a lacking issue of norm enforcement in international law?
I guess that would be a question that we would direct to the lawyer. I mean, obviously, obviously, Guantanamo is a good example for how legal instruments. I mean, me as a layperson would say how legal instruments are used in order to evade a few stark choices that have to be faced within a process where due process is practiced. So there is a stark way to foreignize these. I mean, that's how many in the Americans look at elements. I mean, people who are quarantined in Guantanamo, and to treat them in ways that are partly within, partly outside a normal legal framework. The foreign and the domestic here is fairly clear in the sense of us Americans being threatened in an existential way. I mean, that's at least the perception on the US side, being threatened in an existential way by terrorists of this type, and not being able to conduct the war on terror in terms of normal legal, international law, if not by, for instance, pursuing these kinds of prisoners in a dark zone of detention. I mean, it's a legal question.
It's a legal question, but at the same time, I mean, you see how these challenges are blurring the boundaries of our dichotomies. You know, the domestic and foreign, the legal and the non-legal, war and peace. I mean, there is no war declaration. The instruments are made in a very metaphorical and at the same time concrete way for a war on terror. Okay, but as this should be answered by a lawyer, I rather skip the question, and I tried to pick up a very ambitious point of the volume, and that was, as you heard from Gunther, that we would like, I mean, we're practically regarding the world from this 21st century standpoint, but at the same time we declared that we have the ambition not to be simply state-centered, and we would like to try to overcome methodological nationalism. So there is one very interesting and exciting chapter from Janne Nijman from Amsterdam and from The Hague, and she is looking at the inter-communal interaction. So cities, 21st century cities, discover that they have something like a foreign policy in this global world. They're very strong players, they have their own political interests and so on. So how successful have we been, or how consequent with the ambition to overcome etatistic perspectives in terms of IR and history?
Well, I think we're throwing out the question, and I think Janne Nijman's chapter is one that does it successfully, but also that it poses an empirical question where we'll see where things go. I mean, her argument is that if there is this potential to create a space between the domestic and the foreign by engaging in certain practices, then the activities of cities in certain contexts that are actively labeled as diplomacy rather than sort of intercity fact-finding missions or tours create as it were, diplomatic space for cities in which to operate, which likens them in some ways to what states used to do. And thus, on the one hand, break up the homogeneity of the state, and on the other hand establishes certain large global cities as diplomatic and foreign policy actors, at least formulating the claim. Obviously not endowing cities with the entire gamut of what Gunther has mentioned. I mean, they don't do the three things: make war, spy on others. Well, they might spy on other cities, but they're not sort of the key agents of espionage. But they do conduct diplomacy. And one conclusion that I think is in line with a theoretical concept is that this is an instance where multiple boundaries between the domestic and the foreign can be observed and are in a sense emerging and strengthened, and this contributes to the impression that the state is the key and sort of the only legitimate foreign policy actor may be on its way, may be experiencing its demise and be replaced by something that resembles sort of pre-Westphalian, early modern, medieval, more complicated arrangements much more closely than the state-centered system where we kind of came to know. Whether, however, this will actually play out in that way we might predict is a question that remains to be seen, because there are also arguments you can make that this autonomy of cities may be observable in certain contexts and in certain spaces, but it has distinct limits because there are institutional boundaries to what cities can do, which are different again from country to country in terms of the position of state institutions versus urban institutions and degrees of autonomy cities can claim, but also degrees to which state governments can intervene if certain boundaries are crossed.
So to sum up the ambition of the volume, we said that there are criteria for foreign policy like espionage, war, diplomacy, political will sometimes. So in the case of the cities, we don't have espionage, we don't have the military, we just have
I mean, I'd say we don't have the military and espionage in the present. It's different if you look at different periods.
One way, I mean, just in terms of the Jan Neiman chapter, of course, I mean, the issue comes up. If we speak of foreign policy among cities, this is at least from an IR perspective a challenge. And what I think we've been trying to do in the book is, I mean, and that's probably, I mean, just giving some ground from an IR point of view to colleagues who were willing to use the vocabulary of foreign policy, but not necessarily willing to go all the way as far as war-making, diplomacy, and espionage is concerned. I mean, when I teach foreign policy at Frankfurt, I mean, one of the examples I usually use in order to illustrate to students the difference between foreign policy and other ways of relating among political communities is that I say that Frankfurt and Offenbach are two different political communities, and they are in heated competition in many ways. They're neighboring cities. Of course, I mean, you might not know Offenbach, but if you live in Frankfurt...
Lucky you.
If you live in Frankfurt, I mean, you will... you are from Offenbach. Welcome. So you know what I mean when I say these are distinct political communities at the local level, but obviously they do not engage in foreign policy in the sense of, I mean, preparing for the use of violence vis-à-vis each other, conducting espionage, or doing diplomacy. Just in preparing our session here, therefore, and in the light of what Andreas just said about the Neiman chapter, I thought, in terms of just giving some way from an IR point of view to those kinds of colleagues that use the vocabulary, it does make sense to look at these practices in terms of certain types of uses of violence, which are legitimized or delegitimized. certain ways of mediating conflict among different political communities, which obviously emerge over time, and information gathering of sorts. I mean, the Offenbacher gather information on the Frankfurters, even though they do not send spies, I mean, from what we know, to the other place. Because, I mean, of course, secrecy is not as much a necessity in the interaction of cities within a state framework than it is a fact of life or a matter of life in international relations. I mean, Snowden has shown us to what extent secrecy has become just an incredibly important element in even interstate relations among close allies. I mean, Merkel, I believe, was really pissed when it was discovered that her mobile phone was tapped by the Americans. She found it outrageous, given her personal background, that the closest ally was spying on her with high technical tools. That is a practice which we have come by now to associate with interstate relations. And there are reasons why the NSA is collecting that kind of information. And it draws a boundary of a particular sort. I mean, the same, of course, when it was revealed that the Germans were spying on the French, was quite stunning indeed. The French foreign minister was submitted to the same kind of espionage as Merkel was by the Americans. So there is lines being drawn, even among the closest of allies, the French and the Germans, which you have not been used to in the old days.
But these examples are not questioning our criteria, because, I mean, there is a clear, wording that there is something like foreign policy between the US and Germany, between Germany and France. So what I would like to ask is, I mean, if there is something which is questioning our criteria, if we look at these intercommunal relations. And the next thing is our departing point is overcoming the etatistic paradigm, the nationalist paradigm. And another thing which I found rereading the volume interesting is, I mean, how Eurocentric is that perspective that we have? I mean, we are debating, the Westphalian system that's very naive, and there is the famous myth of Westphalia. But aren't we still somehow reproducing that myth with some kind of perspective when we are discussing it in that way as we did? So, Andreas, I give the
historian.
The historian, the question.
I think that's an interesting question, which we also debated on occasion. I'm not sure. I think it's true that the volume is quite Eurocentric in that respect. I'm not entirely sure, even though that is something else that would have to be tested, whether it makes a huge difference. Because what we could have done is to include chapters that either focus on the establishment of foreign political relations between European powers and non-European powers, or on processes of sort of political community formation, boundary drawing outside Europe. Or at least in the one field that I know a little bit about, the establishment of diplomatic or foreign policy relations between European and extra-European powers. Both sort of the fact that there is a boundary is relatively obvious, as are the practices that go with it. Sort of the establishment of diplomacy, diplomatic relations, status of ambassadorial contacts, compared to sort of trips of merchants or sort of other forms of exchange, are relatively easy to negotiate, suggesting that in most contexts there's a similar process of boundary drawing you can sort of latch onto. And that would sort of confirm our hypothesis that this is something nearly universal. Mm-hmm. I think where the problem may lie is actually in a different question, in the sort of, to take Gunther's Frankfurt and Offenbach example. For the 19th century, it's sort of fun because there's actually a border between Frankfurt and Offenbach. relevant in some contexts and not in others. Frankfurt is an imperial free city and then part of Prussia, and Darmstadt is, and Offenbach is part of the Duchy of Hesse-Darmstadt, which means that sort of deportations, even within the German Empire, can work from Frankfurt to Offenbach, because in that respect it's a foreign country, whereas in terms of domestic political entity with the same imperial parliament, it isn't. There are sort of things you can do on one side of the border that you can't do on the other side. For instance, you can celebrate the 1st of May in Offenbach, but you can't in Frankfurt because it's Prussia and it's forbidden, and so on. How do we actually recognize in those settings the distinction between sort of domestic and non-domestic contacts, and how do we sort of get a starting point of the project was that I mean, large part of Miloš's work and his contribution to the volume has been to trace the language that we now associate with foreign political relations, and to show that this is not universal language with clear antecedents, but that it comes up at a distinct point in time, that it's associated with certain practices, particularly the formation of something understood as international law, and that this point in time is of relatively recent origins. Now we said we can recognize practices of diplomacy, war making, and espionage that are much older, also in terms of the vocabulary to describe some of them, than these foreign political practices, but we're still looking for something we can recognize as part of the pattern, either in terms of practices or in terms of vocabulary, in other settings. And for the time being, I find this very convincing, but I think that's a hypothesis that would bear further testing as to how clear this distinction is. And in a sense, we're weaseling around it with the multiple boundary issue, saying that, well, you can have something but not everything.
Just for the audience, probably the most instructive example of these multiple boundaries comes from Luigi Nuzzo's contribution from international law, where he is stating very clear that international law knows many outsides. So there is the Société des Nations, which is from not only the 1920 League of Nations, but it's also the Vattellian idea that there is a community of states. But this community of states is also having its outsides. So there is colonial law, which is another regime. It's a regime for the peoples who are outside of the benefits of the civilized nations and so on. So this is just to highlight and to make an example what multiple outside means. I would like to make the attempt to discuss with the audience, because I saw Andrew Brandl shaking his head on some remarks. Andrew, would you like to make a brief comment, if I may invite you? Many thanks.
Sure, Miloš. I just wanted to re-ask, actually, Miloš's intervention, but re-embarrass you back, and maybe make an anthropologist in question, because in some ways, I don't know, is this on at all? In some ways, the question of, I mean, I think this is a great project to try to overcome the occlusion of other historical periods in the story of foreign policy and international relations is really important, and there are examples of pedagogical and historiographic accounts in which, say, Thucydides' account of the Peloponnesian War is included in the history of foreign policy, for example. But the question of the centralization of, or the reinscription of European categories, I think, is one that would have been really interesting if we want to dislocate the hegemony of certain assumptions that we're making about, for example, the nation state, right, or what looks like a nation state. And I think even the idea, then I understand there's also pragmatic concerns, but I wonder if you could discuss a bit more how to get outside the assumption that if we went to other places in the world, of which we do have, say, ethnographic records of very different models of governance, very different models of intergroup relations, very different notions of statehood, and also a very and maybe this is an outsider's perspective in IR, but a sort of continuous struggle to decolonize international relations theory or decolonize thinking about foreign policy is something we have not made much headway, from what I can understand. And there are currently scholars who are working on this problem. But what would it mean to not just think of states that are in relation, say, to European or Western broadly conceived states, but those that are, somehow would trouble the assumptions that we make about that? I wonder if we could just push back a bit on what Miloš asked.
Many thanks, Andrew. I mean, for my discipline, it's a very ambitious perspective to overcome, so to say, the categories which are in today's international law, and to deconstruct them and to make a more inclusive approach and, so to say, to globalize the history of international law and international relations. I mean, for many epochs and many geographical contexts, we are really missing records. So we do have only assumptions what contacts and inter-power relations meant in a normative way. I mean, I'm mainly interested in the history of normativity. So there should be some kind of idea that there are regulations concerning external relations. And I mean, it's very clear, I would assume it's very clear that there is something like an outside people are imagining. And if they are imagining an outside, they have very often at the same time the ambition to have political communication or economic exchange with this outside, and you need something like a normative framework for that. And so that might be some kind of a starting point for a foreign policy. But for many political entities, I would assume, I have no idea about that, because I have not the language skills, that we are missing records, how this is in a normative way regulated. Okay, that is a very brief answer. I saw a follow-up question from Hollis, if I may ask you.
Thanks so much. This is very interesting. I have a few questions. One is, how do you isolate the nature of causes when you're talking about foreign policy? So one of the conclusions that I understood the book makes is that boundary drawing is an essential feature of foreign policy, that is the essential feature of foreign policy. How do you isolate it as a causal factor rather than as something that is caused by foreign policy? And just to throw out a couple of possible counterexamples, I mean, isn't it also possible that the fundamental object of foreign policy is the construction of an order, an international order, and that boundary drawing is incidental to the conceptualization of an international order rather than primary? So how do you, I mean, if you look at, for example, the 19th century, how many times did the so-called great powers try to avoid having to change any boundaries? But they had a lot of discussions about what the nature of the international order should be, so around Poland, Belgium, Greece, etc. And the other possible counterexample is economic systems. So much of the way that foreign policy operates seems to take either as its skeleton or to operate on the skeleton of economic relations. If you consider that consuls were tradespeople, or that tax havens are like Guantanamo, or that protectionism is like building walls, which is the primary structure and which is the secondary structure, or can we differentiate between those? My third, this is not a possibility, it's a question, it's about, one of the discussions was about cities as alternative loci of foreign policy production. What about supranational entities? And this seems especially relevant in our time with discussions around the European Union. To what extent is federation an object of aspiration for foreign policy historically or otherwise, and what do federative arrangements bring to the table in terms of our theorization of foreign policy?
Mm-hmm. Hollis, if you can keep the mic, would you say? I mean, I would like to add a question to your third one. I mean, you're talking about federations of states, but how about federations, so to say, of private actors? I mean, we are now in the 21st century, and there are very powerful private actors on the globe, and they have their own normative order, their own legal system. It's very hard to have conflicts with them, so you think about semi-criminal organizations, and I'm joking, like the FIFA or so. Do they have also something like, I mean, they are having their own normative ideas, and they have communication and espionage probably too. At least they were subject to attacks of information gathering by Panama Papers and so on. Okay, this is many thanks for that question.
Well, and I would just add to what you just said that, you know, I would tack that on to the argument about economics being possibly primary as a structure, because financial institutions, international corporations, they do espionage. They function a lot like states in terms of seeking to influence or actively engaging in diplomacy on behalf of states or in lieu of states. I mean, the British East India Company historically is, what is that? A company, a state, etc. So, you know, as a possibility for contemplating what constitutes a unit of foreign policy production, the supranational is also a category that I'd love to hear you reflect on.
Many thanks. Erika, would you like to add, or would you like to wait? It's a new one. Okay, then I'm looking at Gunther and Andreas, and I would be...
No, I'm just getting a little water before I...
Okay.
Let me just come back to the post-colonial theme. I mean, obviously, this is a critical issue. I mean, we're all constrained by the kinds of vocabularies that we prefer, that we have been socialized to learn, that we practice in order to make sense of the world. And it would have been great, and we had colleagues initially as part of the project who might have added a perspective on that. They chose not to follow through with the project. So it's these contingencies that Andreas was referring to that ended up, the book ended up the way it did. The way that I look at it, of course, it is always ethically preferable that those who practice politics in a certain fashion should have a say in describing their practice. So in that sense, I'd be more than happy to include perspectives other than European perspectives on the themes that we've been discussing here in the context of the book, which might come up with, and I'm using the word vocabulary here in a Rothtian sense, come up with different type of vocabulary to describe and explain the practices we're observing here. My sense is, I mean, just from visiting countries outside the West, my sense is, at least, I mean, contemporary international politics, that the nation state of the European type, I mean, is more intact in, say, India or some portions of Asia than in Europe these days, in terms of what kinds of boundaries are drawn between the state on the one hand and the outsiders. Now, obviously, a post-colonial kind of vocabulary is not the vocabulary that the political figures in India and maybe in China are preferring. I mean, realism is really hot in China, for instance. If you talk to Chinese IR colleagues, I mean, my field, I mean, they think that John Mearsheimer's work, he's a hardcore realist in describing international politics. That's the proper way to look at the processes of international relations. Of course, there are Chinese schools to describe these things, but they come up with a distinct Chinese element.
May I ask you something as a historian of international law? Is that another word for denier of international law?
Well, in many ways, of course. You could say that.
It just says there's politics all the way down. That's all it says.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean there's no such thing as international law.
Right. So in that sense, of course, I mean, from what I have been reading about post-colonial theorizing of the international, there is a critique along the lines that you have been mentioning. But the kinds of practices that I think we can observe in a conceptual frame or vocabulary that I've been socialized with is sufficiently, I would at least claim, to make sense of both the kinds of practices that the practitioners themselves believe they are involved in, and also in terms of a distanced, you might say, more critical kind of perspective on what is actually going on in international politics. And this leads me to the second set of questions. Now, as you might guess,
Gunther, if you could speed up a bit, because I would like to hear Andreas about
Okay, just a brief point about causation. I mean, obviously, when you focus on practices and the reproduction of or the transformation of international orders, you're always, pushed to locate causality in some sense. My discipline would normally say great powers are causally significant in terms of coming up with new types of international orders. The US after World War II, for instance, redesigning the Western world, which is now under threat. But I find it, epistemologically, somewhat problematic. And the way, at least, that I've been approaching our topic in the book is to think in terms of co-constitutiveness of certain practices on the one hand, and certain ways to describe orders resulting from it. No, I'm not questioning that there are intentionality, that there's intentionality by actors involved here, and that changes order, and that it can be tied to, for instance, great powers, but that has not, at least my take primarily in the book.
Okay. Andreas.
I don't actually want to say something on the decolonization
Thank you.
point, but just to make two brief remarks on the causality and the economic question. I think the way in which we answer these questions has a lot to do with the relatively strong impact of sort of ancient history scholars on the book, because there you get two constellations which are interesting in that, first of all, you have in the sort of Roman Empire and its medieval successors, you have the idea, you have the practices of foreign policy, but not the idea of an international order, because there's no legitimate international or no legitimate order outside the empire, and that has led us to conclude, or that has led us to opt for this variant of causation, which in the end we choose. And it also has this peculiarity, but that I think is more a peculiarity also of historiographical fashions, but partly of the evidence, that economic facts don't loom large, and that there's relatively little evidence of how the structure of exchange, sort of the equivalent to multinational sort of financial interests, would actually work in the period. And since part of the ambition was to sort of tell a story with a kind of long durée aspect, those are things I would also say we underestimated, and which would play a much more prominent role if we'd focused more on a medium-term historical perspective, I think.
Okay. Please, Erika.
You shouldn't be that worried, Miloš, about the hegemonistic European categories. You have a very phenomenological approach in your thinking, and I think when you go to that level of abstraction, then about the binariness and this alternative kind of drawing boundaries. And about that, I think that you could find that the way the native and alien dichotomy is working out in ancient Greek philosophy, and not just in philosophy, but generally in culture. This creates the whole edifice of rhetoric. So this basic thing, which seems to be the political dichotomy, Aristotle says that it is not a dichotomy, that it is whatever you see as alien is going to appear as native, and whatever you see as native will appear as alien. And this is why he's promoting Greek drama, in which he also promotes the kind of tragedy in which a kin turns out to be your enemy, and an enemy is turning out to be, in a reversal, your kin. Someone that you think is your enemy turns out to be your son or mother, and so on. So that instability of the main political drawing of the boundaries between the native and the alien is already solved in Aristotle's theory. And this is why he says that kinship is unstable as well. We cannot use it, and political citizenship is overcoming that idea. Plato, on the other hand, believes that we have to breathe the youth so that they recognize, like dogs, the enemy. And he believes that there is such a thing as a core value, as basically a kind of a genetic trait that is in a lineage. So you have what we consider as a modern idea in Aristotle already. What I wanted to ask is, I understand that you're saying it's an interdisciplinary book, but then what you do is it's structured around historical periods. And if you could start it again, I understand, and I actually salute this way of letting chance kind of take its hand. I do believe in that. But if you could start it over, wouldn't you want to look at, for example, the rise of the vernacular, the European vernaculars, and what it means in terms of, again, drawing the boundaries, you know, because the same kind of Aristotelian revelation comes in Dante with his rainbow theory of languages, in which he understands that none of the Italian dialects have a value in themselves. They are not Italian in themselves. There is a family resemblance, and which is overcoming this dichotomy. But then he doesn't stop that family resemblance, and he says it actually, like the last Italian village, will have a similar language with the Spanish, the first Spanish village, and so on, the Portuguese, whatever. So what I'm saying is that maybe the historical, like looking at these categories as they are progressing or evolving, might not be a good theoretical approach. Because in fact, for example, that situation, when people have been first time reflected on the fact that their vernacular languages have grammar, and they are as much of languages as Latin and Greek, and when that created the conditions for the nation states, but the nation states already had to have a kind of understanding of being a community of the nation states, and they emerged together with that language game of, let's say, Western countries or Europe. So if we try to understand what's happening today, with our boundaries, classifications, and this language game, it would be good to notice the similarities. For example, with Dante, 1301, when he actually works out what it means for the families to be related to each other, what it means to have an Italian language. No one understood that before him. No one wrote that down before him. They thought they were Tuscan and all these other local languages, but not the Italian language. And at the same time, he said he's the citizen of the world. It's a very similar situation of most of our feelings about.
Okay, many thanks. I'm tempted to comment and defend, of course, some assumptions we made with the historical approach, but I rather take this for the moment as a comment to think about that, and I think if there is no direct intervention from your side, I would like to ask Mitchell Ash for his comment or question. Many thanks, Erika, again. We'll think about this.
A brief supplementary remark to what she said, and before I ask my question, a similar co-creation or co-construction process can be seen in the history of the sciences. In the 19th century in particular, the sciences become nationalized, not just in terms of the structure of scientific activity, although that's extremely important, but also in terms of their mode of discourse and the use of the nation as a resource in recruiting, so to speak, scientific prestige and the like, at the same time as the infrastructure of the universality of science emerges in the form of international scientific congresses and the like. It's not either or, and it's certainly not linear, it's co-creation. And I think we can see a similar kind of dynamic in the history of 19th century of science as well, at least from, not just from an institutional perspective, but also from a discursive perspective. My question is about the social history of foreign policy. There are a lot of different dimensions of that, of course, as the very now quite old position in history that foreign policy has domestic roots and it's not really foreign policy at all, but the projection of domestic politics outward, the current situation in the United States is a very good example of that, I think. It's fair to say. At least the president doesn't yet seem to realize that there's an independent dimension of foreign policy yet. Maybe he will, maybe he won't, we don't know, but that's where he's at now. But that's only one part of it. Another part of the question, of the social historical question, is who gets to do foreign policy? Who gets to do diplomacy? And I wanted to know whether your book contains any social historical remarks about that. I mean, there is, as some of us know anyway, a rather continuous history of certain elites who recruit themselves to do foreign policy. And in Germany, it was really quite remarkably consistent over time that you had to have a fund in your name if you wanted to get anywhere in the foreign ministry, and that lasted for a long time after 1945. Amazing to outsiders coming to Germany to learn that in what was supposed to be a democracy. So there seems to be interesting dimensions here that would be worth more exploration.
That's a very good question I would like to give to Andreas about the protagonists. And
I mean, that's one of the questions that comes up in the chapters. I mean, something we're interested in, aside from the boundary drawing phenomenon, is the question of who actually is able to acquire this quality of foreign policy actor. And that has an institutional dimension in the sense of which states, territories, cities are considered foreign policy actors, but sort of certainly my sympathy also lay with the question of which people are actually behind these institutions. And certainly when you look at ancient Greece, the question is indeed, is foreign policy actorhood more tied actually to persons than to institutions? People who can make a claim to an aristocratic standing and just say that they're speaking for a certain entity that can then be described as a foreign political actor. And I think part of the story where it's a chronological historical approach makes sense is the very, very gradual separation between a sort of personal claim to be a foreign policy actor, either in the extreme case as a monarch, but in the less extreme but equally salient case as a member of a kind of elite group that has always claimed to speak for something more than themselves and has a sort of almost an innate claim to be an ambassador at some point because of the family tradition, and the very slow transfer to an institutional setting where it's clear that only the office creates the power to become a foreign political actor. And you have these sort of, I mean, FIFA might be a case in point, but you have all sorts of sort of parallel diplomacies until relatively late in the day, and actually they may increase in importance, who knows, in a sort of court structure of a presidency or chancellorship or whatnot, that survive beyond the institutionalization and create a challenge for the single boundary as well, as to who makes foreign policy.
I think this is a very important question, and we're trying to deal with it in the book context in terms of different notions and you might also say levels of aggregation of actorhood. Because obviously, I think today we have a new foreign minister, Secretary of State in the US, who is obviously not socialized in a normal foreign policy, diplomatic kind of environment. And we have a president who's conducting foreign policy from a fairly important position now, who has not been exposed to the usual ways of being socialized to that kind of role. I mentioned those two personalized items in order just to contrast the other side of aggregation of foreign policy actorhood that plays a role in the book as well. And that brings me to your supranational entities question. If you look at ISIS, the Islamic State, for instance, it's attempting to, in some fashion to be recognized, an important category, of course, as a foreign policy actor of sorts, a collective type of actor who obviously in a fundamental way undermines the current international order as it exists. So there's a link, the way that the international community deals with ISIS in terms of a potential foreign policy actor, tells a lot, I think, about the dynamics of socialization in an international system. Recognition of Kosovo as a potential international actor that is recognized by a sufficient amount of other states. Those elements are critical in our understanding when it comes to different notions of foreign policy actorhood, both at the personalized level, but also at the collective aggregated level. And in that sense, that would be my take. And as you gather from the short presentations here, we have no agreement among the authors in the book. Supranational entities would not count as foreign policy actors in my more narrow understanding of what is a foreign policy actor, because the kind of, the European Union, again, might be a bit different, because recognition of the European Union as a foreign policy actor has advanced fairly wide, but it's not there yet in terms of full recognition of a legal representative, for instance, in all the international bodies. So that element of recognition of significant others in terms of specific foreign policy practices would, at least in my understanding, be a critical element in order to identify, legitimize foreign policy actorhood. And in that sense, of course, the city kind of example is a bit problematic, at least from a more narrow and you might say etatist type of look at certain ways of practicing foreign policy. But it's as you said, foreign policy has domestic roots, of course, in many ways. But it also has, and your example from science in the 19th century, it also has international roots in the sense of socialized practices that are domesticated in a sense. Things they do out there in terms of foreign policy, diplomacy, and other practices that are adapted in order to be recognized as a foreign policy actor.
Many thanks, Gunther. So we have 3 more minutes to go, and one final question from you, please.
Yes, I'm Felix Blanc. Yes, it's a question about if you have included research on the constitutional boundaries, because you said that foreign policy appears in 17th century. But my question is, for instance, in the U.S. Constitution or the French Constitution, and afterwards, was foreign policy coined as such, and as a means to make the people responsible, or the people, I mean, the servants of the state responsible in front of parliaments, for instance? And was it an important step towards this coining of foreign policy as a normal policy? Because before it was like the reason of states and just something like the prerogative of the king, something either dirty, either we don't know, either in the hands of the nobility.
That's also the Austrian tradition, more or less, that it was a prerogative of the emperor, also legally.
Well, there is a Norwegian colleague, Harvard Lehrer, who is making the argument in his work that the creation or the invention of foreign policy as a distinct practice that he at least identifies in the context of when the word actually came about it's an expression of the rationalization of the state. So that goes, I think, in your direction. It is a concept to also think about the state itself, presenting itself in a certain fashion, and as Lehrer would argue, in a rationalized fashion. So it's an instrument also of state creation in many ways.
Highlighting power. You have some actor you're attributing power to when you say he is in charge of foreign policy and he has these prerogatives like declaring war, managing diplomacy, and so on. Okay, I have more questions. I have the question about surprises and disappointments in the project. But we have no time for these questions, so you can ask my co-editors after the discussion about their disappointments and surprises, what they learned from the other disciplines. And I have also one more question about the future of foreign policy, and this is if there will be always foreign policy, as some of you might have seen on the movie. So this is a film still from Arrival with Amy Adams. So there might be 21st century challenges to foreign policy, which we are only conceptualizing at the moment with outer space law, but no outer space diplomacy. Okay, so this was the last event in this year at the IWM. But it goes on in January with IWM events. So on Sunday, 15th of January, in the Burgtheater at 11 a.m., there is Europa im Diskurs im Zeitalter des Populismus. You're all invited to hear Heinz Bude, Jan-Werner Müller, Mark Lilla, and Alexander Gauland. And on Wednesday, January 25th, there is in the IWM Library, we're here at 6 p.m. Anton Chekhovtsov about Russia and the Western far right. So many thanks. I would like to conclude with expressions of my and our gratitude to the IWM for the excellent organization of this event, to the Cluster of Excellence for funding, organizing, supporting our project in many ways, and for you also my gratitude or our gratitude for coming and discussing the tricky idea, conception of the foreign in foreign policy and the dark sides or the complex sides of this volume with us. Many thanks and have a good trip home.